Okay, this PowerPoint goes with notes 50B to 51B. So I want you to get those out. Go ahead and look over the important concepts from the previous units. And by all means, make notes, annotate on these as we go along. All right, this PowerPoint is going to deal with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. It just kind of gives you some of the history of the scientists at that time and how they influenced his development of this theory. Okay, so this is a picture of Charles Darwin. He lived in England from 1809 to 1882. You will not have to know those dates. But in 1859, he published a book called The Origin of the Species. And he really did not use the word evolution in his book, but he did define evolution as, let me get a smaller pen there, as descent with modification. And evolution was actually, I think, only included in the last sentence of his book. The rest of the time, he called it the descent with modification or natural selection. Okay, and it is an attempt to explain the biodiversity or the different types of life forms that exist on the earth. And as your notes say, he looks at the similarities and differences that exist among even the same species. For example, right here you're seeing the dead leaf moth, and this is one of 120,000 different species of Lepidoptera, which is the group that includes moths and butterflies, okay? They have some things that are very much in common, which is why they're all grouped together as moths and butterflies. But they all obviously have some differences as well. So he looked at that. He looked at the adaptations that a species had in order to help it survive in the environment. He looked at the way it was distributed geographically around the world. And then he developed this theory of natural selection. Now, natural selection has a lot to do with competition, and competition is there in your notes, and I want you to underline that word. That's going to become a central theme of his evolutionary concept and the way that he saw it explaining these things. And the biodiversity that existed. So he said that organisms that had strong or favorable characteristics for a particular area were more likely to survive in that area or that environment than those who had weaker or less favorable characteristics for that environment. So to give you an example of what he's talking about there, let's say that this dead leaf moth is living in the same area as a yellow moth, okay? So they're both living in this same area. Which one of those is going to be more noticeable to predators? Well, the yellow moth. So it makes sense that a predator is looking for food. This dead leaf moth is more camouflaged in this particular environment, in a forested area. So the yellow moths are going to stick out. They're the ones that are going to be eaten. So after 2 or 3 generations, they may leave and go live in another area, or the population of them may decline because lots of them have been eaten. And so you may go back to the same exact location 2 or 3 generations later and find that the population of moths there has changed. You're seeing lots of dead leaf moths, but you're not seeing any of these yellow moths. They've kind of been cleared out. So in that way, nature is selecting certain organisms to survive in those particular environments. Okay, now Carolus Linnaeus, you may remember us talking about him in biology. He lived in 1707 to 1778, and he was a Swedish botanist who loved studying organisms. He loved studying life. And so he became what we call the father of taxonomy. And taxonomy is basically the classification system in biology, the way that we classify things based on similarities and differences. And the reason he did this is he said that he wanted to do this for the glory of God. He was a Christian man and said that he wanted to do this to honor God in some way and bring glory to him. So In his original classification system, he only had plants and animals. And he grouped everything in those, within those two groups. Okay, he came up with something that is called binomial nomenclature. So maybe this is ringing a bell and you guys remember. Bi means two. Nomial is talking about names. Okay, all right, so he is coming up with a way of naming organisms so that every organism has two names. Now, the reason he wanted to do that is because I may call this certain organism a particular name. You may call it something else, and we may not realize that we're talking about the same organism. So they started using Latin. Okay, so this is going to be the Latin language, and the reason they use it is because it is considered a dead language. No nation actively speaks Latin, and these names are used by everybody all over the world, no matter what their native language is. If it's English or Spanish or Japanese or whatever, they all speak the names of organisms using Latin, using this binomial nomenclature naming system, and it is still the system that is used today. So the name for humans, for example, is Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species, which at times is also called the specific epithet. Okay, so that is the name that it is given. They're going to be written in italics if it's typed. If it's handwritten, then you would underline both of those words like that. Okay, the genus word comes first, and it is capitalized, just like capitalizing the beginning of a sentence. The species comes second, and it is not capitalized. Now, within his taxonomy system, he looked at the similarities as their pattern of creation rather than any kind of evolutionary kinship. So he looked at domain, and domain was the most inclusive of everything below it. Okay. Then, as you got more specific, it would fall into one of these other more specific categories. So, if you remember way back in biology, we had a naming system for this, and we put did King Philip call out for grape soda? Okay, did King Philip call out for grape soda? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. All right, think of species as specific. Those are very specific organisms. Those are the same type of organism. They are able to breed and produce fertile offspring. Everything else is more of a very general characteristic. So you can see with the example of the panther that's given here, the domain is eukarya, and that is any organism that has a eukaryotic cell. So you can see that that would be a very broad category. Anything that's eukaryotic, that's plants, that's animals, anything that has a eukaryotic cell that has a nucleus and organelles within it. Then it also falls into the kingdom Animalia. This is all of the animals. Then it's going to fall into the phylum Chordata, which is the animals that have spinal cords. Okay, then it's going to fall into the class Mammalia, which is all of the animals that have spinal cords that are also considered mammals. They produce milk for their young, and they have live young as a general rule. Then it's going to fall into a specific group called carnivore. Or carnivora. These are all your carnivores or meat-eating animals. So you can see as it gets farther down towards species, it becomes increasingly specific. Okay, and so then you go on to family. It's the Felidae, which is the felines. Then the genus is Panthera, which is the panthers themselves, and then specifically the Panthera pardus, which is going to be a very specific type of panther. Okay, George Cuvier was a French paleontologist, someone that studied fossils. And in his work of studying with fossils, He had to look at sedimentary rocks. Some form that way, some form from amber, like what in the sap, tree sap, like in Jurassic Park, the movie there. But the ones that form from sedimentary rock, that means that they form at the bottom of a body of water. And when the organisms die, they settle down at the bottom, and then they just get covered up by layers of sediment or earth that has eroded. Then the weight of the sediment in the water itself causes it to go into a fossilized state. Now, the word strata just means layers, various layers in this rock here. Okay, so all the different layers are strata. And, of course, the deeper you go, the older the fossils, because they continue to get covered up with more and more layers of dirt. So the farther you go down. And he noticed that as you get up towards the top of the strata and become more recent, that some of the organisms seem to disappear. And that at times you would have new organisms that all of a sudden you saw that you had not seen in layers below it. So he came up with his theory of catastrophism. And what he said that if they disappeared, that there must have been some catastrophe like a flood or a volcano or an asteroid or something that caused the species to become extinct. And then he said that they would become repopulated by species that moved in or immigrated from another area. So that was his way of rationalizing how some organisms would disappear from the fossil record while other new organisms would appear later on in the fossil record. The next scientist is James Hutton. And he was a geologist. Of course, this is someone that studies Earth and or the Earth's processes in rocks, rock formations, and things like that. And he is the one that proposed the theory of gradualism. Now, the key to this was basically about the age of the planet. Up until this point, there was a general consensus that the Earth was only a couple thousand years old. Or a few thousand years old. James Hutton was the first one to say that the Earth must be very, very old, because he just reasoned that for some processes to occur like mountains forming or canyons forming through erosion, that the Earth must be very, very old. So Darwin, this influenced his theory a great deal because the natural selection that he was proposing had to occur over numerous generations. So this was the first time that somebody had come out and said that they proposed that the Earth was extremely old, which fit into the time frame for natural selection to occur. Charles Lyell was another geologist. In fact, he was the leading geologist of Darwin's time. And his theory of uniformitarianism is all about things remaining uniform. Okay, so what we mean by that, his also had to do with the age of the planet, that he said that the Earth was over millions of years old, because he said that the same way that geological processes occur today, like, again, the canyon formation, erosion, stuff like that, is the same way that it had always occurred. And in order for there to be such significant things like the Grand Canyon and all that, that it hadn't changed in the way that those things occur over time. The way they occur now is the way they used to occur. And so he said that that would take millions, hundreds of millions of years to occur. So Darwin also used his research, and he had actually written a book called The Principles of Geology that Darwin had with him on the Beagle voyage. So he used that research to further emphasize natural selection. Okay, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French biologist, and he also proposed a theory of evolution, and he proposed this in 1809. So this is actually the year that Darwin was born, so he had this idea first. And he also said that evolution took a long period of time to occur, but he used his inheritance of acquired characteristics by means of use versus disuse. So, for example, he said that the way that traits were passed on depended on how much the parent used or disused that structure. So the example that's given in your notes is if there is a bodybuilder and he did this all the time, and so he did bodybuilding, so his muscles were really, really big, then when he had offspring, that trait, the big muscles, would be passed on to his offspring. Or if there was a dog that lost one of their legs, it was amputated, that because he didn't use that leg, that then when he had offspring, that leg would be missing in his offspring. Okay, and the final individual that we're going to talk about is Thomas Malthus. And he was actually not a scientist. He was an economist. So he studied business and money. And he wrote an essay called The Principles of Population, which was another book that largely influenced Darwin's work. And so he said that we are producing organisms at a faster rate than nature is able to keep up with. It goes back to that carrying capacity that we talked about in general biology. So when you have too many organisms, nature can't keep up with them. There's a supply and demand kind of thing. And so he called it the struggle for existence. Basically, it boiled down to there being a significant amount of competition for resources. Okay, so this is generally the idea that is going to be used for what is known as survival of the fittest, that those with the strongest traits are going to survive, which, of course, in turn supports Darwin's theory of natural selection.